Okay. How are you, Jason?
I'm good. Thank you very much.
I'm excited to talk to you. I like to bring editors on, actually, when I can. But I don't think I bring enough editors onto the podcast, so I look forward to talking with you.
Thank you. I with you.
Thanks. Where are you now? You're in L.A.?
I'm in Santa Monica, to be specific.
Okay. Santa Monica? Okay. And now, wait, you came out of the VCFA film program, what time? Or rather, roughly when?
Last October, this past October, I got my degree, my MFA.
Oh, very good. And you found that experience to be, I guess, a positive one. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't want to get into it.
Oh, no, I thought it was wonderful. I mean, if you want to hear the story,
Sure, yes.
Yeah, I've been editing for decades and teaching for the last, since 2013. And one evening I was teaching a class at a small college, Columbia College up in the San Fernando Valley, Columbia College Hollywood. And I was co-teaching a course with the dean, and we got pretty friendly. And one evening after class, he mentioned he was going to be hiring full-time teachers, but they needed to have MFAs. And I said, that leaves me out.
I have heard that before, yeah. Yes.
And he told me about VCFA. And I looked into it, and I wasn't sure I wanted to do it because I was, as I said, I was already teaching. By then I was teaching at USC, which is a great film school. And I thought, why do I need this degree? I'm not sure I do. But in speaking with Stephen Pite, who at the time was the program director, I told him that I was writing a book about editing, about basically a memoir called Everything Matters, that's about editing as well as my journey over these decades through the profession. And, I suggested, what if that was a thesis project? Could I get away with that? And much to my pleasure and surprise, he took that to whatever committee they take it to, and they approved it as a project. So I enrolled in the program and basically spent my time there working on this book and getting wonderful feedback from the advisors there, who, of course, are not writers in the sense of memoirists or novelists or anything, but they know the business very well, and they're storytellers. So they were able to
so you have a very unique, case, or,
Yeah, I was going to say I was the only one there who wasn't either making a film or writing a script.
Right. Oh, interesting. I didn't realize that was the case. Do they even have like an editor path or?
Not really. I mean, it VCFA, like most film schools, I believe, in the country, I may be wrong, but I believe I'm right, are not production oriented. They don't have the facilities or the money or the wherewithal to have their students making films. So they tend towards, critical studies and film studies, and I think if students are making films, they're doing it more on their own. I don't mean to come off as knowledgeable about this. I'm not, but that's the impression I get.
Well, you're the closest thing to an expert that I have, Jason. So.
Oh, my God, what pressure. Anyway, VCFA certainly is one of those that do not have a way of doing production. Students who are making films there or writing scripts, it's a low residency program, as you know. So people are working on their own and then bringing their material to these residencies that we go to twice a year, where we spend a rather intense week, a week plus, actually.
So what did you do? You were just what were you doing during the residencies, plural? Were you bringing in your latest drafts or your most updated work and sharing them and asking for feedback?
Right. Or that's exactly what I was doing. I mean, I couldn't obviously share the entire manuscript, but all the students would upload whatever they were working on, and then accept, invite feedback from other students, and so it wasn't uncommon for me to be uploading bits and pieces of what I was doing. But when I went to the residency, I would pick out something that I could either read myself or have someone else read in, say, 15 minutes. So it was usually a part of a chapter, and
Mm-hmm.
and then I would get feedback, and I got really wonderful encouragement. So many of the students that are in the MFA program are also teaching, and one of the greatest things that I would hear is how much they would like to use this book in their schools and classrooms.
Well, that, of course, is a very nice thing to hear, sure.
Sure. I mean, the idea of the book is it's not a how-to book. It's
It sounded more like a memoir. Your journey to and through editing, being an editor.
I mean, each chapter is built around one film primarily, and what I learned on it, because I never went to film school, I learned on the job. So I could look back and look at how different films taught me something else about how to pull story and subtext out of a film. And at the same time, my students at USC and at Columbia prior to that would often ask me questions about the business. What's it like out there? How do you survive? How do you work with directors, when you're not driving the train? Everything, they wanted to absorb anything I could give them. And so
Sure.
I would share my stories with them and realized that this book needed to incorporate that journey because, surviving as a freelancer in this business for now, I guess, my fourth decade in the business is not easy because there's always ups and downs. There's victories, there's failures, there's times when you're king of the hill, there are times when you feel like you want to, crawl out the door and hide someplace. It's a lot of life experience. And that's usually what I'm sharing with the students. I don't usually hold back in terms of both the good stuff and the bad stuff.
And then they go to classmates or other students and they say, don't take Jason's class, he's a bummer.
No, actually, the classes are pretty...
I'm just joking around.
Yeah, I hope so, because no, it's definitely not a bummer. But there's a whole lot around carving out a freelance career where, so much of it is who people want to work with. And so it's not just talent, it's not just skill, it's not just speed. A lot of it has to do with your personality and how you get along with people and what collaboration looks like. So all this stuff is in that book.
I would think that it would be an especially important skill set for an editor because you really have to build a shorthand with your director or producer or those two people. It's as though you're part of the core filmmaking team. You are... I don't know if you're, sometimes you're in the same room with them as you're editing, and sometimes you have less time perhaps with the director, and you're really the person in there making a lot of the choices, correct?
Yeah, that is correct. You're writing the final draft, in essence. That it all happens in the editing room, and everybody has spent, the director, the producer have spent years perhaps putting this project together, and a lot of people went out in the field, and some, went through a lot of difficult physical and emotional, whatever experiences to get that footage shot, and then they hand it all to you, and it's like, here, make this movie happen, and it's a huge responsibility.
Yeah,
and you have to really honor that responsibility. It also depends on the kind of film you're working on. I've worked a lot in narrative film, but I've also worked a lot, actually more, in feature documentaries, particularly character-driven feature documentaries.
That's what I was going to get to. Yeah. It looked like a lot of your work, actually, as I go through your filmography, it does look like documentary. But do you find that those two different types of filmmakers speak different languages, so to speak?
To a certain extent, the language is different, but not really. I mean, because the kinds of films I do and the kinds of films I get hired for, the story is still paramount. I'm not really, usually you're not going to find me doing investigative pieces or, informational, quote unquote, information-led documentaries. It's as I said, more character-driven films. So in that case, you're dealing with the same questions that you would ask in a narrative film, which is, what's
That's
actually going on here? What's the subtext? What's
Yeah.
driving this person to do what they're doing? And how do I visualize that? And
explain what you mean by character-driven film if it's a documentary.
Okay, I think you said you watched Breaking Point, War for Democracy in Ukraine, which is a film I did
watch it, yeah.
with Mark Jonathan Harris a few years ago. And so on one level, it's a story about this revolution that happened in Ukraine in 2014 and throwing out the president who was pro-Russia and had betrayed a promise to join the European Union.
He's a puppet.
Yeah, and then the civil war that followed when Russian-backed forces as well as Russian troops themselves crossed over the border on the eastern end of the country, and so there was this long civil war, and the country, Ukraine, had really no army, or what army they had really fallen into bad times. So all they could do was depend on the civilian population. So
can I just interrupt for a second? And I know this is getting off topic slightly, so we'll circle right back, I promise, into the point, which is about character-driven documentary. But when you say it's a civil war, and I know you know what you're talking about, so I'm not challenging you, but why is that considered a civil war if Russians are invading Ukraine and the Ukrainians are assembling their own homespun army and fighting the Russians to get them out?
Right.
How is that a civil war?
It was really both. I mean, first the Russians invaded Crimea, which is part of Ukraine, and had virtually no resistance and took over that peninsula.
Right.
But then in the eastern part of the country, there were, like a lot of countries in Eastern Europe, the more eastern parts of the country, there are more people who speak Russian than who speak, in this case, Ukrainian.
Interesting.
Whose
self-identified?
Whose religion is usually more, say, the Russian Orthodox Church, whereas the other part may be either Roman Catholic or something else. But there's historically been a Russian presence and Russian descendants in those parts of the country. And so
I understand.
So when this revolution happened, those populations on the east, encouraged by, and in some cases aided by the Russians, took up arms and declared their independence from Ukraine and had their own republic. And there was, 10, 15,000 people died within a relatively short period of time, in the fighting. So, I think Russia's always denied that they were directly involved, but that's not for us to discuss. Anyway, the point of the film is that when I say character-driven, is that we looked at these events through the eyes of 6 characters, all but one of whom actually were civilians, and then basically became embroiled in this upheaval in their country in one form or another. So it was their point of view, their experiences that we focused on. Mm-hmm. So that's one example of what I mean by character-driven stories.
I understand. Those could be talking heads, but you're actually talking about something else, because talking heads are the experts that some documentary filmmakers use to drive home what have you, whatever. But you're talking about also, in a way, creating a narrative with the specific people you're choosing to represent the film's point. So it's very specific. It's very, I'm sure there were a lot of people that could have been chosen, and you're part of the decision-making about, okay, these particular people will drive the narrative of this film.
Yes, I'm
or help create a narrative.
Yeah, I'm certainly part of that team, so I have input. But let me take another angle and see if I can explain this a little bit differently. What I'm talking about is making an experiential film. as opposed to an informational film. So you mentioned interviews, for instance. So one filmmaker may, as you said, hire experts to talk about Ukraine. We did have some people in this film who were able to explain the macro level story and give it some perspective. But primarily what we're talking about are people who experienced this. So like in any narrative story, in any scripted film, the goal is to have the audience go on a journey with the characters. And in this case, in this film and all the other films I do, that goal is the same, is to have the audience experience, in this case, experience what it's like to be in a war, and literally on the front lines, or in the middle of a riot where the police are beating people and shooting people, and you're literally in the middle of it, because we live at a time when everybody's walking around with a camera on their telephone.
That's right.
And so the footage
a gift to documentary filmmakers.
Yeah, the footage is stunning. But interviews work as well if you know how to use them. When you have an interview with someone who experienced this, as opposed to someone who's an academic or who was outside of it explaining from the outside looking in. When you have someone who was involved in it, I have a particular way I tend to think of this, and that tends to be memory is the word that comes to mind. What you're looking at are people who are not relating information as much as they're reliving an experience. So when you have someone sitting in a chair talking to a filmmaker, a battle they were in, or a friend who they saw die, or whatever, the trick for me as an editor is to evoke the memory, the emotion that this person is reliving in their mind. And the way that I do that, one of the major tools I have is what I would refer to as body language. One of the advantages I think I had as an editor from the very beginning was I came out of dance. I was a dancer, not a great one, but I did it for a number of years. And to turn a phrase, I learned how to speak body language. And if I learned how to speak it, then I knew I could read it. And so from the very, very beginning of my experience as an editor, I was able to use everything from, the slump of a shoulder to a glance, to, a half smile, to, darting eyes, whatever it is that tends to betray something or to reveal something that's going on underneath the surface. And if you can do that during an interview, you can evoke a memory as opposed to just information, and it changes the experience of watching it.
You can actually turn off the audio and get the same emotional message from those subjects, from those characters, if you want to call them characters, that you could, if you could had the audio on and hear them, what they're talking about. And I feel like the journalist, what was her name, who lost her husband?
Oh, yeah, Tatiana Chernobyl, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what an incredible gift to a filmmaker to have her in the film. And then there was also the children's theater teacher.
Right.
And he was magnificent. Well, and I really appreciated this, such strong characters. And then the film is also supported by a few talking heads who provides context. I thought it was a very exceptional documentary, actually. I'm just coming off of it, so it's more immediate for me, too. And I felt very moved by this whole story. Just glad for the opportunity that I got to see it.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your words. I do. I also appreciate your point about sound, because it's wonderful that you mentioned that, because the way that you can find those physical manifestations is exactly by doing that, by turning off the sound and just watching people's body and what they're doing with it. And so you're not distracted by what they're saying, and it's those pauses in between the sentences. It's sometimes when they're simply listening to a question, and their eyes sort of drop down as if they're going inside. Those become very valuable shots.
Yeah. I'm going to recommend it, even though we're talking about larger philosophical ideas about editing, but I'm going to recommend this film to people. Where can people see it, by the way? It's called Breaking Point, The War for Democracy in Ukraine.
Yeah.
It sounds pretty political and heavy-duty, and it is, but it's also just a really well-made film about an important subject that's very inspiring, especially right now.
It's funny, as soon as you asked that, I went blank on where it is. Senior moment here.
I can fix this in the edit.
I think it's, I know you can browse for
iTunes.
it. Yeah. And you can find it. You know, the funny thing is, since you bring this up, is the fate of this film is actually another lesson that I've had to learn over the years. And I think anybody in a creative life really needs to learn, which is once you finish something, you lose control of it. And so if you put your emotional survival, your happiness, your ego, whatever, into what happens with the film afterwards, you're more than likely going to be pretty miserable in your career, because there's very, very few people who get luck into those films that all of a sudden everybody's talking about. And there's so many factors that go into that, not the least of which is publicity and marketing, but obviously timing, and you can't control that. And in this sense, you know, halfway through cutting this film, this other documentary came out called Winter on Fire that was about really just the first part of ours, the street revolution in the Capitol. And it got a ton of press. Netflix got it, marketed the hell out of it, and it really took the wind out of the sails of our film. And so by the time our film came out, it was basically people saying, well, we've been there, done that, what's next? You know, so you know, what I consider one of the best films I've ever done, and working with a 3-time Oscar winner with Mark Harris was such an honor and such an incredible pleasure. But, you know, most people have never seen the film or heard of the film. So you have to you have to learn to let that stuff go. Otherwise you can't survive.
I understand. Let's talk about another project that may be a nice case study where you feel like really exemplifies where you really are at your best, at your maximum, where your contribution is the most significant, I suppose. Where something that really felt important to you.
You're asking me, or you had something in mind?
Yeah. No. Yeah. I mean, obviously, Breaking Point is one of those, and I really enjoyed hearing you talking about it, and I was interested in maybe hearing you talk about another project that is really important to you.
Okay. Well, there's a couple of films. There's a filmmaker named Joshua Rofe, who is the director and co-producer of the Lorena series that's on Amazon now.
Oh, yes.
And it's a four-part series called Lorena.
Yep.
And I was not in the chair on that project. I got credited as supervising editor. I worked with Josh and his partner, Stephen Berger, and 4 incredible editors. And I was able to give some input to it, but I was not working full-time on it. But the reason I bring it up is because I met Josh back in 2012, and we did a couple of feature documentaries together. The first one called Lost for Life, and the second called Swift Current. And Mark Harris, who directed Breaking Point, was a producer on both of those. And the three of us basically, I tend to think of it as Mark came in as a third leg on a 3-legged stool, and really made a huge difference on the films. And Lost for Life was Josh's first full-length film and first full-length documentary. It was an interesting story to talk about the film because basically he had met a guy who was a father of a friend of his who was a judge in Florida, and they got into a conversation at some dinner party or something, and the judge told him a story of having, I think Josh's question was, what was the hardest case you ever had? And it turned out to be a 15-year-old girl in Florida. He was based in Florida, who was being tried for murder. And she was 15, a minor, but she was being tried as an adult, and
Yeah.
DA's offices often have that discretion. And she was found guilty, and he was forced to sentence her to life in prison without parole. That was a mandatory sentence for someone found guilty of murder as an adult, even though she was 15. He went and interviewed her, and then he found other people around the country. He would go into prison and interview other young people who had also been tried as minors, but they were tried as adults. They were minors when they committed these crimes, tried as adults, given mandatory life without parole sentences. So then he and I met, and we started putting this film together. And from an editing point of view, what was really a challenge was there was no real story attached to it. There was a bunch of individual interviews with these prisoners. Only in one case were they connected to each other, and in that one case it was because there were two young men who committed a crime together. But in all the others, they were completely separate, often in different states. So the question was how to really create a story out of that. In most cases, there were no supplementary interviews or supplementary material. Somebody's parents, somebody's girlfriend, somebody's high school buddy who could talk about what they were like when they were, what drove them to do these things. So it was difficult, extremely difficult, to figure out a structure, which is where Mark Harris was so effective when he joined us, and we finally figured something out. And basically, it became a story of, I could say it's Act 1, what did you do? Act 2, why did you do it? Act 3, is there any redemption? So in the first act, we were learning what each character did, and they were pretty horrendous crimes. And then it was in the second act that we finally got the backstory. What drove you to do something like this at that age? And then the last part was, well, now could you forgive them? You as an audience member, could you forgive them? Would you want to see them out of jail? And we didn't want to answer that question either. It wasn't an advocacy film. The way that the film really finally, I think, succeeded was by seeing each individual character as a different facet of the same person. So it was like we created an imaginary person that was the whole of all of these parts. So no one character was able to give you a full story arc. So, each one would fill in the gaps where the other one left off. So they, in a way, they became one story arc through these various characters. So that was a real challenge editorially, to pull that off. The next film we did, Swift Current, was a challenge in the sense that the whole film really took place in somebody's mind. It was focused on Sheldon Kennedy, who was a very successful NHL hockey player, professional hockey player with Detroit, with Toronto, I think, possibly Calgary. Anyway, mostly with Detroit. But he had a very troubled career. A lot of drugs, a lot of alcohol, a lot of ups and downs. And then finally revealed years later that he had been sexually abused by his junior hockey coach. And it had left him traumatized. And he was trying to deal with this trauma through drugs and drink and anything he could.
Sure, or not deal with it. Right?
Or not deal with it, exactly. So, Josh was a sort of amateur hockey player and loved hockey, and so this was he was fascinated by this story. So we were able to, in a way, climb into Sheldon's head and try and see what he saw and why, as an adult, and even now as a very successful advocate for children with children who are survivors of childhood trauma, to the point where he's been honored around the world, but yet still fights these demons. And so it was an exercise in how do you visualize somebody's nightmares in a way. And this is documentary again, so it's not like you can go all theatrical on it, so you have to find that body language, you have to find visual metaphors, that can help express all of these emotions. So, it was a wonderful challenge for me. I'm working on a project now which I'm actually not completely free to talk about, but it follows 4 families in the Midwest, and was shot over a period of 4 years, all of them dealing with transgender kids. And, it's really, in a way, a family drama with this added
Yes.
element of, oh my God, who am I? And why am I not what I'm supposed to be?
Right.
And this is more pure cinema verite. So it's got some interview, but it's really driven by scenes. You don't see that many cinema verite films anymore because they're hard to shoot. They take a long time.
And you got to get out of your own way when you're making that film, so you don't.
Yeah, it's not easy. Not easy. Yeah.
I just wanted to know where your memoir, your book is. Where are you at with that?
Well, it is a complete manuscript, so it's 300 plus pages. And I'm now, doing rewrites. I actually enrolled in a postgraduate semester at VCFA in the writing program, in this case.
That's interesting.
Yeah, in order to work with their faculty, which had been, the faculty is amazing, and the students are amazing. I was at a residency, in this case, it was this incredible residency in Cozumel, Mexico, and back in January. But I was really stunned by the level of talent of the students and the faculty as well. And so I've been getting to work with them. So I'm in the throes of polishing and rewriting. This is a craft that's still new to me. So I wanted to go out to publishers with at least the best foot forward that I could come up with within a reasonable amount of time. So the goal is to have something out there making the rounds by the end of the year.
I guess if you had to say, like, where VCFA, the greatest impact that program had, where it had the most impact, I guess, and it doesn't even have to be developing the book. It could just be on a greater, more philosophical level, as an artist. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, let me try something. I think that I went into the VCFA program not as an editor. It was really stepping off a cliff for me. I was going there completely outside my comfort zone, and the school is so geared towards nurturing and supporting the creative process, and it gave me the courage and it gave me the room to dig deeper, and I think that in so many ways the advisors I work with, Michelle Negroponte in particular, and Laura Colella, and I can't even really not say the rest of the faculty, because there was so many comments and so much input and on an informal basis from everyone, and just kept driving me deeper and making me kind of pushing me to be more vulnerable, pushing me to be more honest and more open.
That sounds like Michelle. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. He's amazing. I had an amazing time.
I agree.
With him. But, there were so many others that, that were not in a formal position with me, but without whom I don't think I could have pulled this off. And the encouragement from the other students, who, as I said, so many of them are teachers, and, who felt that this was so useful to them. And way beyond just a book about editing, that it was really a book about the creative process, about, creative growth, about how you survive in this business, about storytelling in general. So the program gave me the wherewithal and the courage to pull this project off. There's no way in hell I could have done it without it. And of course, part of that is the fact that I had deadlines every month. So, a huge element of me enrolling in the first place was wanting that and needing that discipline. And I think that for, students who enroll in a program like this, that's a major, major factor, is that, you can't just take your time, and you can get very self-indulgent. You need to meet these deadlines, and it really forces you to focus. And I think when you're in a low residency program where you don't have to be on campus and show up in class every day, that sort of discipline is imperative. Otherwise, I think you can't possibly pull it off. And 10 years later, you're wondering why that film never quite got finished, or that screenplay hasn't quite gotten out there yet. I think it's an incredible school. I really do. And I support it every way I can. As an alumni, anything I can do as an alumni, I'm there. So,
wow, yeah. High praise. Well, good luck with everything, with the next steps with the book, with your film projects. It sounds like you're in a great place right now.
Well, keeping busy keeps me off the streets. Editing by day and writing, getting up early to write and writing on weekends. Mm-hmm. Whenever I can. Yeah, I mean, a lot of inspiration is my wife as well, who's a writer. So, I feel like I'm in this creative bubble, and I like being in a creative bubble.
Yeah, I can relate to that. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. I really appreciate this.